Hello again. Every day I talk to people who have an addiction, and the thing that I notice most common in almost everyone is confusion and doubt and lack of confidence that they can ever end this addiction. And the reason for that is that there's not readily available information that really explains addiction, that really gets to the root of it. And over the last 15 years, even longer, through my own addiction, through becoming a healthcare practitioner and then becoming an addiction specialist for 15 years, I've been through a journey of understanding. I've gone from the very conventional medical view right through to where I am at the moment with consciousness-based, awareness-based understanding of addiction, transformation and recovery, where I see addiction as a real doorway, a real opportunity to really change your whole life in such a positive way, well beyond simply just ending an addiction. So today, what I'd like to do is I'd like to, in a sense, recap and review that journey in the hopes that you can learn from me in this video what I've learned in the last 15, 20 years. Some of these insights have taken me years in between insights. So I really just want to create this video to help with that confusion about what is the best method for me, or what even is a method for ending addiction. How does addiction work? Rather than just saying, I really need to quit and I'm just going to try something that I haven't tried before, without really understanding the mechanisms in your brain that are creating the addiction. And by default, you're just going around this quitting cycle where you try, you maybe have some success, and then you end up having a strong emotional event and relapsing. And then again, and then you blame yourself, of course, and then you eventually have had enough again after some time, and you do the whole thing again, not really evaluating or being able to understand the different methods and what's really common and what's really missing from these methods. So that's what I want to clear up in this video today. And I also want to, of course, share with you what I think is the massive opportunity that, in a sense, that people with addiction are unique in having this opportunity to such a degree. So let's start with where I was when I had my own addictions. I mean, I at one point realized that I had had some form of addiction on a daily basis for 25 years. And sure, there were periods of abstinence. There was changing from one addiction to another. Mostly it was weed, cigarettes, nicotine, alcohol. There were other things along the way, but in terms of substances, those were the things that I was addicted to. But I didn't realize also that, I had other emotional addictions in the sense of addictive codependency in relationships. Ultimately, what I've learned is that the root of all of this is in a sense, my addiction to myself, that habitually I preference myself over other people, which is really something that I'm aspiring to hopefully bring to an end so that, I really do treat everyone equally. Don't put myself above others, just equal, without that habitual tendency to be self-centered. So you can see that my view of addiction has broadened from purely substances or behaviors right through emotional, and even some would say on a spiritual level, the type of transformation process that happens on a deep psychic level. So, but back when I had addiction, I didn't know any different to anyone else. I I was training as an acupuncturist. I was learning Chinese medicine. I went to China, worked in the hospitals there, became an acupuncturist, worked for 10 years as an acupuncturist, and I quit my addictions. I have to say that they changed. Like I quit cigarettes before I started as an acupuncturist, but years later, alcohol took hold. Um, and and I look back now, I can see that it's the same root, and so I had to end up, ending alcohol addiction. But back then, originally when I quit cigarettes, I honestly thought from the medical training I had in the Chinese medicine education, we did Western medical sciences as well. And from that education, I thought that addiction was all about the substance, as in the alcohol or the opioid or whatever, or if it was a behavior like gambling, the dopamine, the imbalance in brain chemistry. So the idea back then was that if you got rid of the substance out of your system, your brain chemistry would normalize and then you wouldn't be addicted anymore. So that's literally what I thought. And, that view is in a sense still the prevalent view, although some things have changed. The recognition of how trauma impacts addiction and things like that have become more commonplace, but still there's this underlying biological view of addiction where addiction is, in a sense, the imbalance in brain chemistry. Now, when you view addiction just like that, the problem is that, let's say you go into detox or you have a period of abstinence, your brain chemistry will normalize quite quickly within weeks, even most of it quicker than that. So therefore, if you were to relapse when your brain chemistry is rebalanced, what does that say about you? If it's purely this biological view, what it says about you is that you made a bad choice. So that's really hard to take. That's really demoralizing, because then you beat yourself up. You say, I did this, I'm so stupid. And I see that all the time, with my clients, with people I talk to. There's this sense of, I stuffed up again, or I fucked up again, and there's this real self-condemnation. And what comes along with that is shame. Shame that I made the wrong choice. I was weak. I wasn't strong enough. And the consequences of this addiction, if it's affecting your friends, your family, I'm now affecting and hurting them. And the sense of shame and guilt, anxiety, all of that is, I think, large part because of this biological, purely simplistic biological view of addiction that says it's all about brain chemistry. But, I don't believe that. I don't see that. That does not make sense to me anymore. I'd like to explain why. So back then, when I'd quit cigarettes, I thought I could help people, my patients, as an acupuncturist, quit cigarettes as well, because we learned it, so-called addiction protocols. We weren't really taught the theory of what I understand now about how addiction works. We just taught these protocols and the Chinese medicine diagnosis of that, which does make sense. Actually, the Chinese medicine diagnosis really does hold up. It's just that the treatment doesn't hold up, just purely acupuncture. The Chinese medicine view of addiction is where we would say that there's an imbalance with the heart. Now, we're not just talking about the heart organ in Chinese medicine, we're talking about the emotional and the subtle regulation of the whole system in Chinese medicine. Chinese medicine doesn't view the brain as the center of self-regulation. It views the brain as a kind of a computer in a way. The heart is said to discern the balance between heaven and earth, between the physical and the spiritual. And when there's harmony, then everything in the whole body is healthy, everything functions optimally. And so when someone has, let's say, a strong desire for a certain high, we would say that that'd be an excess, and there'd be a deficiency somewhere else that is allowing that excess to occur. So that all makes sense to me, and I'm not suggesting it makes sense to you, but I'm just saying that while I think they have an underlying understanding, the treatment of purely just using acupuncture to deal with that didn't actually work, because when I did treat people, even let's say after 8 sessions, I only had about 30% of people quit. This was back 20 years ago. And that's 30% of people quitting is equal to people using willpower. That's about people who use willpower are about 30% effective at quitting cigarettes. So I thought, well, the acupuncture is obviously not really doing any difference, because the people that quit well and truly could have been just using willpower. So I thought that I wasn't making any difference, and I stopped doing that. And then some years later, this company approached me who was using laser acupuncture. And I honestly, through my experience, just thought that was just no different to my experience, and therefore they weren't trained acupuncturists, they weren't trained in Chinese medicine, so therefore I thought they were kind of quacks, really. But after a lot of pestering by them, I went out and had a look, and I in all fairness, I said, well, if these results are true, they were claiming, more than 50% success, then I should be able to verify that. So I got their people to call as many clients as possible within a few days, and to my surprise, over 50% of those clients had quit. And I thought that was interesting. So really the difference was the laser acupuncture. They didn't have any understanding of the psychology. They didn't have any mental interventions or anything like that. It was purely a treatment, and off they go. So I started doing that. I thought that was worth it. So I got interested in that. But then I realized that what was happening was people were ringing up for telephone support, and they were actually struggling with withdrawals, with having physical withdrawals and mental withdrawals, in the sense of cravings, which were also leading to things like anxiety, panic, and some of those were quite extreme. So I realized that even though we were giving the same protocol to everyone, some people would have these emotional and mental symptoms and others wouldn't. But that told me that there was something missing. We didn't understand what cravings were, and we didn't understand the anxiety that occurred. You see, that was not part of even the general literature, Western medical literature, in understanding addiction. It was all labelled in the bucket called withdrawals. And this could be anything from just having persistent cravings or thoughts to smoke, to, in terms of other addictions, full on DTs and shaking, tremors, nausea, vomiting, and really quite serious things if we're talking alcohol, severe alcohol seizures and things like that. You see, this is not well explained. The way that the Western medical system explains those severe physical symptoms is the brain chemistry imbalance, and that makes sense, but it doesn't explain actual cravings. It doesn't explain the anxiety. So there's a lot of gaps there. So after there was this, what happened was I had this breakthrough. I was sitting in the clinic one evening about 7:30 in the evening, and a client rang up, and he said that he'd seen me 3 months ago and had actually quit. But on this day, he'd relapsed, and he was ringing up for help. And I really couldn't understand that, because this is in the days when I thought that it was all about brain chemistry. So I got off the phone, and I was genuinely bewildered. I was thinking, how is this possible that his brain chemistry is normalized, he had no nicotine in his system, and yet he had a desire to smoke, and he actually smoked? How is that possible? This brain imbalance theory is not complete. It doesn't explain this. And right then I looked down at the bin, and there was a bin full of packets of cigarettes that people would throw away, after I'd given them the treatment. And there was an unopened packet, brand new packet with the cellophane on it. And I looked at it, and at that moment, I had a desire myself to have a cigarette. And I realized that, hang on a minute, I haven't had any nicotine in my system for 10 years, yet I'm having a craving right now myself. How is that possible? Just like my client hadn't had anything for 3 months, and then he had a craving. So I realized that I was having a craving there and then, a mental craving. There was no physical symptoms, purely mental. And I tried to locate that craving in my head using my Chinese diagnostic skills and my Qigong, which is a form of internal feeling, aware sensitivity that it's similar to Tai Chi. But you learn inner sensitivity. So I tried to locate this in my head, and it just disappeared too quickly. So I couldn't. I just thought I mustn't have been quick enough. So the craving went away too quickly for me to find out where it was. And then I had another craving another day or so later. And by now I was really curious. I wanted to know what these cravings were, because I knew that the brain imbalance, chemical imbalance theory wasn't complete. So if I could understand what these cravings were, then maybe I could figure out a more complete understanding of addiction. And if you've got an addiction that's much, let's say we might think stronger than cigarettes, I mean, that's debatable, but there are certainly substances and addictions that have a much more powerful physical or mental impact. If you're one of those people and you're thinking, I'm talking all about cigarettes and maybe that's not relevant to you, I will come to talking about all addiction in a moment. I'm just giving you my story of how my thinking developed. Just happens that it started with cigarettes, but it actually becomes relevant to everything. So what happened was, one day, after many attempts to try and find this craving when it occurred and kept on failing, I thought, well, what if what I'm doing to locate this craving, what if that's making it go away? And I thought, that might work. That might be it. So next time I had a craving, I didn't try to locate it. I simply just did nothing. I just observed that I had a craving. I kept observing. Yes, it's still there. It's still there. Did nothing, and it persisted. And it wasn't until I actually tried to intervene and find out what this craving was that it disappeared. And I thought, aha, that's it. That is something. Because I effectively had made the craving go away with what I'd intervened with. So I realized that I'd kind of discovered a technique to make the mental craving disappear. So I kept on experimenting with this in my own experience and then refining it. And then I started to teach my clients. And this was a big breakthrough, because what happened was these withdrawal symptoms that occurred afterwards were much diminished, because when they occurred, the withdrawal symptoms always occurred after someone had cravings, right? That makes sense? So you have the craving and then you have the reaction, withdrawal reaction. So if we could make the craving go away quickly, which is what this technique does, then we could prevent the withdrawals symptoms from from progressing. And that's what occurred. So I had a much higher success rate, around, bizarrely, around 80% of people that completed my program would end up quitting cigarettes. Now, that's not to say that this was a complete understanding. It wasn't, but I thought it was at the time. And it was also not to say that some of those people didn't relapse, because they did. And this, again, showed me that there was something missing, because what happened was my clients would use the technique, and I was combining it with the laser acupuncture at the time. They'd use the technique after the treatment whenever they had a craving. And the people who remembered to do the technique, or people that could do the technique efficiently, effectively, they found it quite easy to quit. There were people then that forgot to use the technique. It might have been a few months later or a year later, and they had a strong emotional event, and that led to strong cravings, and they forgot the technique or forgot to use it, and then they relapsed. So what that told me was that, okay, we had a way of getting rid of the cravings, but it was temporary. Why? Because the cravings were still being generated. The cravings in the mind were still being generated by your mind. And I also still didn't understand what these physical fight, these kind of the anxiety, the urgency, the fear, sometimes depression, self-doubt, all of that would occur when these cravings occurred, or particularly when someone relapsed, or when you delayed in having your addiction. So I still didn't understand that at that point. I understand it now, but what ended up happening was I realized that I hadn't got to the root of it. Yes, I could help people get rid of the cravings, but they kept on having to use that technique ongoingly because I hadn't got to the root of it. I hadn't, in a sense, helped people get rid of the generation of cravings in their mind. And so what ends up happening is when people, they either use the technique that doesn't require willpower, the one I teach, or in conventional, other systems who don't know this technique, they would end up using willpower. And willpower is the conscious mind blocking the body from taking action when there is a craving. So my system was better than the conventional because it didn't require willpower. It didn't block action. It just simply made the craving disappear. But I still hadn't got to the root of what was generating the cravings. And so at this time, I decided I realized I hadn't got a full solution. I needed to delve into how the brain was working. And I did study some neuroscience when I was doing my Bachelor of Applied Science. So I went back into neuroscience, and I realized that these symptoms, these withdrawal symptoms, were a lot to do with fight or flight, the fight or flight system in the brain, which is an emergency survival mechanism, because this system is triggered when there is a threat of danger. But what does danger mean? A threat of pain and suffering. So, and I realized that fight or flight can be triggered not just when there's a physical life-threatening situation, but when there's any threat of pain and suffering, although it's maybe more subtle. And this is what happens when there's the threat of you not getting to satisfy your addictive craving. The subconscious, in a sense, is triggered, that is a sign that there's going to be pain and suffering. So it brings on the fight or flight. The urgency to have your addiction, the fuzzy thinking, so you don't think straight when you've got cravings. It could be anger, which is fight, annoyance, irritation, or flight, which is depression, denial, distraction, keeping busy. And the more that the cravings occurred, the more that this fight or flight would escalate, and this would overtake the conscious mind and cause the addiction to happen. So this explained, the fight or flight system explained why you could consciously know that you wanted to quit your addiction, that it wasn't good for you and you really didn't want it, but still subconsciously the behavior was occurring, the addiction was still happening, because the subconscious, these fight or flight systems are designed to take over the conscious mind. So that explains why things are out of control with addiction. So that explains a lot of the withdrawal symptoms. And it also explains why the cravings are being generated. It's because the subconscious mind is just trying to help make sure that there's no pain and suffering. But unfortunately, this is a bit of a circular argument, because the pain and suffering is caused by the addiction, in the sense that the fight or flight is triggered with the threat of not satisfying your addiction because of the perceived pain and suffering from withdrawal, which is actually largely fight or flight. So the fight or flight system is almost being triggered to get rid of and prevent the results of its own reaction, which is the pain and suffering of anxiety and fear and annoyance and things like that. Does that make sense? It's a circular reaction. So that's part of it. Now, the other part of what we'd say the survival systems is the reward system. And this is not just for survival, but when we discover something pleasurable, this reward system will mark that as a strong point to remember by releasing some dopamine. And this gets released into the pleasure center, the nucleus accumbens in the brain, and causes an intense momentary pleasure, which brings on desire, as in craving. So when you eat something sweet, that is remembered, by, this chemical process, partly the dopamine that's released at that time. And then we also know that you can have a pre-release of dopamine. So if you just think about something sweet without even seeing it, without even having it, you can then have a pre-release of dopamine to increase the likelihood that you're going to go and get that, because this system is trying to help you get pleasure. So, for example, sex, there's a pre-release of dopamine because of the system is, in a sense, motivating you towards procreation, towards the pleasure of that. So these two systems, the fight or flight system and the reward system, both working in tandem with addiction. This explains a lot of the generation of cravings, the bit that was missing in my earlier understanding. And you see, it also makes sense that some people are more motivated to have their addiction to get rid of pain. Let's say alcohol is very common for that, or lots of drugs, dulls your suffering of life. It gives you a break. It's kind of an escape from reality. And that's to get rid of pain. And then sometimes people are more motivated by getting pleasure. This is particularly true if your life is boring, or you don't feel like you've got purpose, or you don't feel like you belong, or, having some pleasure really makes a difference. So a lot of these symptoms of, addiction withdrawal are explained by understanding the brain and how the brain works. And so for a while there, I was thinking that we simply just need to retrain the subconscious. And I think I still hold that view that that's true. Question is how? So it took me many years to really refine an understanding of how to retrain the subconscious. And I think I've spoken about that in a lot of my other videos. So I might revisit that at the end here, but I'll keep up with the story. So I realized that this technique that I originally stumbled across wasn't enough to retrain the brain. And the way I realized that was I was teaching my clients every day. I was seeing one-on-one clients, let's say 8 clients a day, and I was teaching them this technique, and I was actually performing the technique in my own mind, my own experience each hour, each time I was teaching someone else. And after a while, I realized that I wasn't getting any cravings anymore. So whereas prior to that, I'd had cravings every so often for 10 years or more. But then I started to realize I didn't have any for 1 month, 2 months, 6 months. And when it was about 6 months, I realized something had changed. But it was only after I started teaching my clients this for some time, maybe, a year or more. And at that some point along that, I realized that my cravings had stopped. So something else had changed in my brain. So this was kind of the next level. So discovering the technique was the first breakthrough. Then discovering what stopped the generation of cravings was the next level. And this also coincided with my upgraded understanding of how the brain worked and how withdrawals were being and cravings were being generated. So I then worked on integrating these two pieces. One is, the neuroscience, and the other is how the heck did I stop my brain from generating cravings? And it was around this time that I really connected the state of mind that this brief technique, the initial technique that I discovered, I started to realize more consciously the state of mind or the state of being that it opened up within my own experience. And so rather than this being a brief 30-second technique, I began to explore and practice this technique for longer periods. And this is when I realized that there's a much deeper level to our state of to our state of being than we realize. And that deeper within us, deeper than our ordinary thinking, deeper than our emotional ups and downs and the suffering of life, in a way quite fundamental to our awareness and our existence, is a state of being that is inherently at peace. It's inherently doesn't need anything, doesn't have desire for anything extra. But that doesn't mean that this state is kind of void and vacant and empty in the sense of lacking, because in a sense, this experience is completely full. There's nothing lacking. There's no need for anything. So it's kind of full, yet still doesn't need anything. It's hard to put into words. So I started to ask my clients, what are you really looking for? And almost universally, it would come, we'd talk about things like, I just want to have a good relationship. I just don't want any struggles. I just don't want any pain and suffering from my addiction. But, I kept on going deeper, encouraging them to answer me more deeply. And as they reflected, almost everyone would say they just wanted peace. And in my own experience, and I think you can verify this too, peace is a very deep pleasure and it's a deep contentment. And this is a state of being that I suppose I stumbled into, but now has become very, very clear to me that this is the answer to addiction. In fact, this is the reason why addiction exists. It's because we're not used to experiencing peace and contentment in our life. We're constantly trying to find peace and contentment, which, a simplistic level could be simply continuous pleasure or absence of pain or a bit of both. But this type of contentment I'm talking about, it's beyond pleasure and pain. In fact, you can have pleasure and pain and you realize they're just kind of fleeting phenomena or fleeting, let's say, streams of experience that occur amongst every other stream of experience. And what do I mean by that? Sound is a stream of experience. Sight is a stream of experience. Sensation is a stream of experience. Your other emotions are streams of experience. Your imagination, your memory, all of these are streams of experience. And then the content and the combinations of those can be at times more pleasure or more pain or whatever. But underlying all of that is the fact of awareness. Without awareness, you wouldn't know of any of this. And this is very much part of this state of being. Awareness is, in a sense, the way that your conscious mind can connect with this state of being. And when you experience this state of being, of this deeper state within you, of contentment, of this deeper peace, your subconscious no longer, like your fight or flight system no longer perceives that you're in danger. Your reward system no longer perceives that you need pleasure to be okay, because this state of being is inherently deeply okay. So these systems let go, which means they stop generating cravings for your addiction. And you end up having more conscious free choice because you're no longer being badgered and pushed by these subconscious desires. And so on a very deep level, this is the answer to addiction. This explains the root of addiction. It explains the withdrawals, and it explains how we can use the conscious mind to bring about a transformation in the subconscious reactions without willpower, without fighting the subconscious. This is very, very powerful. And this, if you look at ancient wisdom traditions, in fact, you could look at any real wisdom tradition. And what I mean by wisdom tradition is a tradition that brings about a transformation of their followers to a deeper state of peace, of oneness, of love, of selfless interconnection and care. A state of genuine okayness. Now, of course, each of these systems can have, a variety of conceptual belief systems, but I'm really looking at the heart of it, which is the inner transformation and relationship with, you know, the deep relationship with life, existence, and you call it whatever you want to call that. But we have direct access. And I look back now and realize that's what all of my clients are looking for, even though they don't know that. They're always saying peace, contentment. They're not just saying more money, because if they say money, I say, well, what would you do with that money? Oh, I'd buy this or that. Why do you want to buy this or that? Because I want to use it. Well, why do you want to use it? What's the feeling? What is the result for you? What's your experience when you use that? And it all comes back to some kind of satisfaction, some kind of deeper contentment, really. So this is how I've gone from the biological, mechanistic, materialistic brain chemical imbalance approach to addiction right through to a more holistic, consciousness-based or awareness-based understanding of addiction. And it's literally taken me 15 years to get to this point. And a lot of those realizations that I mentioned along the way might have taken 2 or 3 years or more in between to formulate, to understand. And of course, I'm walking this path the whole time. I'm testing everything in my own system and also working with my clients. And wherever there's something not making sense, then there's further investigation. But I can really say that now I really am confident that we have, the broad understanding and also the pathway and system to bring an end to addiction, but not only bring an end to what I would say the superficial manifestation of addiction, which is the substance or the behavior. That's on the surface. That's a symptom of the deeper problem or deeper lack or deeper kind of gap in our evolution, which is this deeper alignment to our deep nature. And now, of course, you might think, oh, well, I have to become a saint in order to end my addiction. No, addiction ends quite early in the piece, but you realize that this method or this pathway also helps with emotional regulation. It also helps with your deeper purpose in life, your deeper yearning for wholeness. And so quite naturally, my service has evolved into addiction to freedom program, which then leads on to emotional freedom program, which leads on to living with awareness program, and a community of people who are involved in this transformation journey. So I hope that this has given you a real insight into what's possible with addiction, and that if you do have an addiction, it's far from the worst thing that could have ever happened to you. Um, if if you're able to use it, if you're able to use it to motivate you to travel this path. I mean, I'm not trying to make light of any tragic occurrences that might have occurred at all, but I'm saying wherever you're at, we can only go forward from here, and you can use it from this point forward to motivate you to go inward in places that you haven't been able to before. But you want to do that in a safe, gentle, not forced way, that's very natural, just like a plant growing and opening up. It is it's become, you know, a real a wonderful experience for me to see other people benefiting through this. And I hope that this really inspires you. So I think with that, I'll leave it here and look forward to maybe meeting some of you. There's a masterclass if you want to look up further. You can see that in the description. I'd also love to hear any thoughts you might have or questions even in the comments. I'll answer each of those individually. All right, take care and have a wonderful rest of your week wherever you are. See you soon.